Welcome to today's training for the OPUS Fiscal Grant Burndown Package. This package of software changes support the new business processes derived from the release of the OHCS Spend Down and Reallocation Policy. At the start of the new state biennium on July 1st, 2019, all state grants will follow these new processes, with federal grants coming on board 3 months later at the start of the new federal fiscal year. This video is intended for experienced subgrantee OPUS fiscal users and will highlight changes that will affect them. These changes will be live by July 1st. We are working on the OPUS test platform with stale and made-up data, so anything you see here is not real. The first noticeable change will be to the Notice of Allocation or NOAA report. So let's log into our creative user and go to our OPUS Fiscal Report screen, and then we'll bring up the NOAA report. I have a creative user. I also created a fictitious agency that we'll use for most of our demo. Go to the report section, the fiscal, go to NOAA, and normally you just hit load. First thing you'll notice is it says there's no valid GAC transactions. And that's a reminder that every time we start a brand new biennium, we have a new biennium listing in here. And it always defaults to the most current, even if there might not be any data for it yet. So this is something you need to be aware of, especially for the first few weeks of the biennium. This will also be very important on the future federal grants too, where you'll have some grant allocation categories that are going to be in two different bienniums for the same grant. So now we'll hit our load button. And I have a couple grants created in here. We'll just run this whole thing. And what you may notice is now we have two new columns called Allocation Type and Allocation Comment, where previously we had columns of CFDA, grant phase, and purpose of allocation. These reports are only so large, and there's only so many columns we can fit on them in order to try to keep them small. So it was determined that the grant phase and the CFDA really didn't add much to the report, so those got replaced into here. Let's talk about allocation type. We go back to our NOAA report. We notice down here we'll have a notice NOAA allocation type definitions, and there'll be a highlighted link. We click on this. It's going to bring up a PDF. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'm just going to hit the high points on this. But previously we had a purpose of allocation field, and it was a text field. And the problem with text fields is it's hard to have consistency on them. People put different ideas, different spellings, different reasons, and it was very hard for us to try to go through and try to put all the same types of allocations together. So we come up with a drop-down list, and this is populated, and this is now whenever your program analysts do an allocation, it's going to fall into one of these types. And what used to be known as the purpose of allocation, that's now the allocation comment field. We just sort of renamed it, and most of the time it won't be used. It'll only be used if we have to add a little different information or a little enhancement information about why the allocation was made. The big thing with this is you notice it's prefaced with an AA or a CA. AA means administrative action, and these are just the normal day-to-day things that happen when to create a NOAA. And there's CA, which is corrective action, and these are in cases where the agency is having trouble expending their money in the field, and so funds have to be, either they're going to be removed or they get too much money is rolled over, and it really we need to address why this isn't being spent out. Some of the big ones: allocation, budget change, correction. So rollover biennium is one of the big ones, and this is going to be used for the federal fiscal year whenever it crosses that state biennium. In the past, we really had to create two different grants to, because the grant was bound with the biennium, but now the grants are going to no longer be bound with that. They're going to run for 1 year each. And so this label here it'll just tell you the money was moved between from one grant agency category to another, but they're going to have different bienniums. So, and then there's allowable, because if your grant allows it, there's a 10%, and there's a third rollover under the corrective action. And in the first year, because this is a growing learning process, subgrantees, if the grant allows it, can roll more than 10%. Going forward, the expectation is there's not going to be more than 10% unless there's going to be a special exception. And the other thing is for the historical data, we always have to have a way to deal with all the data in the past. It's snapshotted, and we have to reference it, and there's data retention rules around it. So we use this little symbol of a dash and a caret to sort of show like a little arrow. And basically, when you see that, it means you have to look at the comment to see, what the original purpose of allocation was. So let's move back to our report. So an example of a historical one, I happen to have a notice already brought up, and you see here the little dashes, and they say look over here. So next, let's go look at the grant burndown report, since this is the main driver of the new process. You can reach it, two of the standard ways. One is if you're in the report section on the left nav, you have a linkage there, or on the report page itself, it'll have linkage in there. And the first thing you notice is we have grayed out. We can't click on it. Whenever we deploy new functionality or add new reports, new screens, users have to be assigned them. We don't automatically do it. So if you can do it yourself, that's great. If you don't have rights to do it, you'll have to see your system admin. So in this case, I happen to have somebody logged in as system admin already. So we're going to go into edit roles, and we go under report, and we go ahead and we click on this and save it. Now we go back to our user and we refresh. And now the link is now active. So clicking this will then take us to the grant agency burndown report. So first we're going to pick the state fiscal year 2019. I have an example data set up for that. We'll hit load. This will populate up standard format. You've probably seen it for your no report too. So if you had multiple grants, they would show up here. You'd pick which grants you want to run your burn down reports for. You'd have one agency, so you'd be locked in for that, and some sort options we'll come back to later. So we'll hit the submit button. We'll bring up the report. So it starts out grant burn down report, fiscal year. This will tell you what fiscal year these are in. The thing is, you can run all the grants that are in the same state fiscal year together, or federal, but you can't mix it between the two. You're picking one or the other, because the swim lanes are all different, and we'll get to that here in a second. Next, you'll have grant, and the next line down, of course, we have the agency. We have the NOAA amount. That's all summed up here. AGR amount, that's agency grant requests. So every time you spend money from the NOAA, you have to do an AGR. And these are AGRs in ascent status. So if there's something in the pipeline, it doesn't show up here yet. This is only the final step. Next, we have percent expended. That's just the AGR amount divided by the NOAA amount expressed as a percentage. And then we have work plan type. There are 3 types of work plans. There is the initial, there's the amended, and then there's the final. The initial, everybody always has an initial, and work plans come from working with the OHCS's program analyst, and they will work with you to figure out how you're going to burn your money down, or how it's going to be spent out into the community. If there's some issues with getting it out and have to go back and redo the percentages, then you would get an amended work plan. After that, if there's still issues trying to get the money spent out into the community, there'd be a final work plan would be generated. The next part of the report's broke out into two parts. There's a standard plan and a work plan. The standard plan, all grants have to adhere to this. And this is like the default. Time is broken out according to the policy. It's 25%, 50%, 75%, and 90%. 10% of your funds need to be spent out at the 25% time mark, 25% of the funds at 50, 65 75, and 90 at 90. It is due to the leap year, and people really be hard figuring out exactly the time frames. These were actually converted into dates. So for the state fiscal year, the first mark is at 10/1, and then at January 1, and at 4/1, and then 90% through is roughly May 25th. There's also when it starts on July 1. So if you think of these as swim lanes, there's the first swim lane that starts in July 1, but the expectation is you haven't got the money yet, therefore you couldn't spend it. So there's $0 are expected to be spent on day 1. Once you reach October 1st, the expectation is 10% needs to be spent out, and at that time it would be reviewed. So what's 10% mean? Well, once again, it's sort of hard for percentages, so we actually calculate out the amount to expend. So the expectation is by 10/1, you will spend, in this fictitious case, $14,000. As we see, they spent 34, so therefore left to expend is 0. So moving along to the next swim lane, so on January 1st, the expectation is you have 37 spent out. Well, in this particular case, they had not. There's actually a little bit remaining, so this would have actually raised a flag. But at the time of this demo, it is in June, we were actually now would have been in the final swim lane. So expectation is they would have had 134,000 spent. There's actually 99 left to spend, and this is obviously not a good thing. Depending on what date was the last date, you'll have a little flag here going on track. So it was October 31st, it would have been a Y here, but since they haven't expended out, that's why there's an N. The second part of it is a work plan, and this is your agency and the OHCS program analysts work together to determine how the money's going to spit out in the community, and this gets translated into percents in the same time frame. So the time frame will never change, but these values here can and will be different from the standard plan. So in this fictitious case, was said we're going to spend 20%, then 25, then 79, then 82. So big thing is it's always the percentage either stays the same or it gets bigger. There's no going back or it dropping lower. So in this case, we had a similar thing where met the first goal, second and third and fourth goals are not met. However, what we look at is both of these together, so you have to not meet both of these goals to actually trigger a flag. So in this case, nothing happened the first quarter, but the second quarter, something would have, some sort of review would have happened at this point. Next, we have committed funds. Committed funds, this was requested by Capo. Committed funds explain the rest of the story in spending in the community. Because you can have committed funds, but not requested yet. And they wanted to have a consistent methodology to be able to collect what the committed funds were out in the field. So there is a way to enter those. I'll show you that later in the system. This is an optional item. You're not required to put in committed funds, and it's really left to the subgrantee to determine what if they're going to do it and what their processes are going to be. So who's going to collect the data, how often are they going to put it in. That's left all up to you guys. If you do put one in, we take whatever the most recent one was. In this case, there was a 10,000 was made on 5/10/19. If you don't do one, it'll just be blank. It won't show anything. And the final item on the report is grant categories. In this particular case, ESGP has quite a few different categories, and so all the categories that are summed up into the no amount and the AGR amount are these categories. To reiterate, you see admin is not in here. Admin is not tracked. It still has to be spent, but it's not part of this process. Also, exempt grants, are also not part of this process. If it's a particular grant where it's admin only, you would not find a grant burn down report for your agency for that. There's a few grants out there that are like that. So let's go ahead, we'll go back to close this out, we'll go back to the main report page. We have a couple other options. We have a sort option, agency grant. That'll probably be the one you'll want to use most in the field. That way all your grants get bound together. Grant agency tends to be for OHCS because program analysts want to pick one or two grants and then see all the agencies underneath. The third option, though, is a graph. These graph, it's one grant agency combination per page, but this gives us a nice visual representation of what we're talking about. So while the grant agency burned down, had a lot of data and stuff, this is more easy to understand, easy to see view. So once again, we have the grant agency burn down report, but it's a graph. We have the fiscal year up top. We have ESG 18 to tell you which one it is. Then we have the agency name. The left side of the graph, we have amount remaining. This is dynamic. Depending on how much money was in there, this will scale according to that. And then we have the 1 year burn down time here at the bottom. And these date lines are generated by the tool. So what we have here, we have our standard plan. So if we plotted out our standard plan and the 4 different points, the graph would look like this. And then you have your work plan, and your work plan, the points of it get plotted on here. The idea being is your burn down should be on the inside, or trailing right along with these. If it's above this, that means the money is not being spent out in a timely fashion in the community. So the actual line is every time you do an AGR, and once it reaches sent status, it becomes a new point. So in this particular one, it looks like there's there was 3 different requests put in for funds. And then the final point, we take whatever the last AGR was in sent status, and we put today's date. That's why you see this long line. Of course, I told you this was stale data, so this is just a fictitious example. It would probably never get to this point because we had a couple different check-in points. We would have went in and adjust, somehow either got more spending out or funds had to be removed, but to get it there. The other idea is that on the very last day, even though you have up to 60 days after the close to get all your requests in, this would end up being 100% one way or another, whether we roll funds or they all get spent out. So next we'll go and we'll take a look at how to put in committed funds. So if you go up here under Request for Funds tab, you'll see there is a GA committed funds. This is a right. If certain people have it, it's the same. It's in the same package of rights that if you can do new AGRs, it falls into that one more properly. Let's go take a look over here. The AGR RFF preparer. So they have that one. And then under fiscal view, you can see this search screen, you can see them, but you can't create them. So whichever one there. So we go here, there's two. These are the two. The only reason why there's only two, you have to actually had a grant agency burn down rate has been assigned to your grant agency yet. Same way, you won't show up on the grant burn down screen either. And we'll go more of that here in a second. So pick that one, bring it up. Remember, I had that 10,000 on there. This really just says agency, the grant, the committed funds, the last user, and the date that happened. There is no edit or delete function. We always look at the last one. So if you want to create a brand new one, you can just click on this, and you come in here. And now we're going to say, oh well, we requested some of our funds. Now it's only 5,000. So we'll hit save. The other thing is you could have left this blank too, and then you could have seen all your ones if you want to get a little list. If you want to print those out. Now we jump back over and go back to the burn down report. Hit load. And sure enough, so now it's at 5,000. And we said before, it doesn't affect any of the upper numbers, but it is now on the report. Go ahead and close that out. Next, let's look at the agency grant request search screen, also known as the AGR. The first change you're going to notice is biennium is now added to the screen. And the reason for that is since all grants are now 1 year and we forward allocate at the beginning of the year, that means instead of having multiple allocations during the year, you're going to get one big sum at the beginning of spending authority. This was done for the grant burn down because we needed to have 1 year increments to run the burn down charge. So the federal fiscal years used to be broken up into two chunks. There'd be a 3-month chunk and a 9-month chunk. In order to make those burn downs work for the year, we moved the biennium tag from the grant down to the grant agency category or the GAC level. So biennium had to be added on here now because it's potential and probably very likely that while you're finishing up one federal grant year and you're starting a new federal grant year, you'll have funds in both grant years you'll be spending, and you need to make sure which one you're actually working in. So we hit our search screen here. You will notice our first one right here. So we have, the same agency name, same code, same category, yet there are two different biennium dates and two different dollar amounts. So on the AGR new screen, our next changes, you notice biennium was added here also because in order to create agency grant requests, For 2 different years, you have to have the ability to be able to pick which biennium you want to do it in. Used to be you just had a grant, which we populated with only those grants you had, but since we have to populate both grants and bienniums, it's possible you might get combinations that don't work. For instance, we have a BPA 19 and we pick 1517 and we hit load. What will happen is you'll get a message that says either this grant or categories have been closed for the agency or no funds have been allocated. The other thing is it doesn't exist. Of course, that also you can't allocate funds to something that doesn't exist. But the next thing we do, so let's go to BPA and let's 1719. Remember, we talked earlier about having to have a grant agency burn down values or record added to a grant before you could spend on it. Here's an example of one that's missing a grant agency burn down. So notice the admin category is just fine. We could go ahead, we could allocate funding to it if we wanted to. However, the second one is blocked out, and down here the note says, the category is missing a grant agency work plan burn down rate. This category is disabled. Please contact OPUS Help Desk to get this resolved. If you run across this, it's nothing you can do. You'll have to contact OPUS Help Desk because the OHCS program analyst will have to be the one who goes in and adds that burn down rate in there before you can actually spend funds against it. It's a requirement. Now, as we see, admin, you can always do admin, and if the grant is an exception, you can always spend the funds on that. And all the other rules still apply too, so if you already had something in prep status, this would be blocked out, or if the grant happened, this grant agency category happened to be closed, that would also be in there also. And our final place we're going to go, we need to take a look at, pretty minor, but an agency grant request view screen. Biennium has been added to the top here. That way you can see that it exists when you're working on it. Also the print screen, that's also been updated, and we got biennium on this too if you need to print it out. That pretty well concludes our changes for the day. If you have any questions, you can contact OPUS Help Desk. Thank you very much.